The Mystic Wanderer, a practical guide to mysticism with Stephen Weiss. Hi, I'm Steve, and welcome to The Mystic Wanderer. So what I'm going to talk about on The Mystic Wanderer is the experience of mysticism. And mysticism is a practice that tends to be universal across all the mainstream religions. And I want to talk to you about those things. So first of all, I want to talk about what mysticism is, because the word sort of in the vernacular, at least in America, when people talk about it, they think of this sort of mystical, fantasy fairy world, or they associate mysticism with magic. And it really isn't those things. So I really want to talk about what mysticism is. If you look up the term mystic, what you'll see in like the Oxford Dictionary, for instance, is someone who seeks by contemplation and self-surrender to obtain unity with the divine or the absolute. To go along with that, to believe in the spiritual apprehension of truths that go beyond the intellect, or really beyond thinking. It's a very interesting thing, because I think in the Western world, thinking is like everything. We have Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And we end up in this place where we get stuck in thinking, and we think thinking is the only way to exist. And we're always thinking, and we can't sleep because we're thinking. And it's very interesting, because thinking is something, yes, we do, but it is not something we are. And that's one of the great truths, I think, of mysticism. So we'll look more into that. What I plan to do with these Mystic Wanderer recordings is kind of to give you some lectures in the style of, if you've ever heard of some of my favorite teachers, like Ram Dass and Alan Watts, and newer teachers like Richard Rohr, where it's going to be about 35 to 40 minutes of just a simple lecture that you can put on while you are doing something else and learn about mysticism. And what I really want to do is give you something that's very meaningful, because basically mysticism has saved my life in a way. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about my story and about how I got there. So the way that I got into mysticism was basically like all of us, we all get older, and I got to a point in life, midlife, I guess, as you would say, and I had this realization where I said to myself, I can't just keep living the same way that I've always been living. It doesn't work anymore. With my older self and my older body and everything I've been through and with all my experience, I can't live like I did in my 20s. I can't live like I did in my 30s. There's got to be another way to live. And of course, the source of all wisdom that everybody knows is Facebook, right? So I went to social media and I posted and asked my friends, and I said, hey, what book or, what did you listen to, or what can I read that will tell me what to do now, because I need another way to live. And of course, if you know my friends, they have a sense of humor, so I got a lot of jokes and things like that. But one friend, and I'm sorry I forgot who you are, so you can tell me if you see this and say, I'm the one. But one friend said, hey, there's this book called Falling Upward by Richard Rohr. And it's about what he called the second half of life. And I believe he got that term from Jung. And interestingly enough, a lot of mysticism sort of overlaps with Jung, Carl Jung, the psychologist. So if you're familiar with his stuff, there's some interesting overlap there, because he talked about inner work a lot, and that's a lot of what mysticism is. But I got the book Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, who's one of my main teachers now. And I talk about my teachers a lot. When I say my teachers, I don't know them personally, but I listen to them online. And I have some main ones. I'll tell you the main ones I have. For kind of Christian mysticism, I have Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating and Cynthia Bourgeault. And then for Daoism, I have Alan Watts. And then for Buddhism, I have Shinzen Young. And then sort of Hindu, I think I would say, is Ram Dass. But he's definitely a mystic and very interesting to listen to. But they all have these different pieces of mysticism. And really what I plan to do with this podcast is to bring all of them together for you. So you don't have to go get a piece of it here and a piece of it there. I'm kind of combining everything together. So I started reading Falling Upwards by Richard Rohr, and I was really amazed because he said, okay, look, this is exactly it. The second half of life is not like the first half of life. And the first half of life is sort of establishing who you are and your boundaries and building your ego. And it's an interesting thing, and I'll talk about this more at times, but the ego is not a bad thing, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's something we construct and sort of are intuitively constructing as we live to exist on this earth. We need to be able to do things, and so we kind of, you can think of it as clothes maybe. We put on our ego. I'm going to put on my ego and go out and do things, right? And so we kind of need to have an ego. But once we realize we're not our ego, that's where one of the freedoms come from mysticism, where there's a layer behind the ego, our true self that exists. And once we look into that, we see a level of freedom that we didn't have before. And I definitely have experienced that. So I'm reading the Falling Upwards book, like I said, and I'm getting all this stuff about, my true self and the second half of life. And the second half of life, right, once you've built up your ego and set your boundaries, is to learn to let all of that go. And it's kind of interesting because we see what happens to people if they keep, I guess, constructing their ego more and more and building more labels and rules about life. You become more and more narrow-minded, right? And you sort of become the proverbial grumpy old man, where you only have one point of view and everyone else is wrong, and you're grumpy about it. And, and I don't want to end up that way. And so I realized that, we learn to let go of the ego and all these boundaries and labels that we have. And that leads toward mysticism, right? So that's how I got started. And so after reading that book, I was very curious about the other things Richard Rohr has to say. And I found out he's a Christian mystic. And really, that's how I came to mysticism myself. I came from a Christian background. And so my mysticism is really connected through Jesus and what we call Christ consciousness. Now, after looking at this, and I've listened to, for instance, Shinzen Young for many years, a Buddhist teacher, and he has always said, for many decades, as he's been talking, that there is a connection between all these different religions. And there has been, Christian mysticism since like the early 2nd and 3rd centuries of the church, right? It's not a new tradition. It's been there. And, Buddhism and many other faiths have had a mystic tradition. So this particular Mystic Wanderer podcast is not just for Christian mysticism. I'm just telling you about my background. But I'm really going to put together, as I said, all the different perspectives from the different religions. So I came from a Christian background, and if you know, how can you not know, especially if you're in America or Europe, that Christians are very contentious. And I grew up with that contentiousness. And, I was one of the people, like many of us, that asked questions and said, I don't think this is right, or why do we do this? And eventually I got pushed further and further out of the mainstream. And I feel like I'm way out of the mainstream now. I more consider myself a mystic than a Christian, though, again, I relate through Jesus to God in this way. But there are so many ways to pursue oneness with, God, the universe, the divine, the source, the maker, so many ways to refer to the great creator. And I also sometimes I will refer to God as he or she, either one, because everything is in the divine. So you'll see that as I go on. But I felt this, and I connected with the mysticism, and so I started pursuing. And I had been doing meditation for a long time because I experienced a very harsh trauma where I was abandoned. There was someone that I was in love with, and I thought I was going to marry her. And we had a relationship, and then she left the country and never spoke to me again, and I didn't find out why, and I didn't get closure, and that very much broke me. But it led me to starting meditation, and it led me to my counselor, and eventually to Shinzen Young, my first meditation teacher, really, and brought me to the beginning of my journey. But it wasn't until many, many years later, until I went to Falling Upward, that I really got into more of the aspect. And there's so much to it, right? Which is why I already have like 20 different topics to talk about what is in mysticism and how to practice it. And this is going to be very practical, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time in theory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in history. If you want to find out about the history of the mystics, there are already podcasts about the history of the other mystics. But this is going to be very practical for you and I to take a walk forward into oneness. And I hope that it serves you well. So one thing we want to do as a mystic is surrender to the divine and join in union with the divine. And basically every major religion has a mystic practice. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. There are 3 major faiths. Well, one is probably a medium-sized faith, but I very much like it for reasons I'll tell you about. But Buddhism and Hinduism are basically already mystic in their practice, right? They already have meditation and contemplation practices, and they already have a built-in desire to let go of the self and join with the oneness of the divine. The medium-sized one that I talk about is Daoism. I really love Daoism because I was introduced to it through the Tao Te Ching. By the way, it's a weird American thing or English thing where originally it was translated as Taoism, but we realized later on, more recently, that it should be Daoism. But because a lot of the older translations and things like that were Tao, you'll see Tao and Tao, right? So that is the same thing when I refer to that. And Daoism has this wonderful aspect to it where it doesn't really separate humans from nature, and I think, Alan Watts will talk about this a lot, where we've sort of divided ourselves from nature. And for some reason, it's part of the Western and the Christian mindset where we see ourselves as kind of this separate thing, having to rule over and fight against nature. But we are nature. We were made out of the earth. I mean, if you look at it from the Christian perspective, we were made from the earth. Like, we're part of this ecosystem, right? We are made to be part of this ecosystem. We couldn't live without the air and the water and the thousands or millions of bacteria that's in our bodies and connected to this earth. We are part of this system, and our actual biology extends beyond our bodies. If we were this body in a vacuum, we would die, right? So we need everything that the planet has, and we're really part of it. And why would we think we're exempt? We eat, we live, we reproduce, we die, just like all the animals. We're part of that. And it's a beautiful thing, right? And sometimes it's scary and awesome and big, right? Because nature can be a force. But what happens is once we remove that barrier between us and nature, we have a much more peaceful time living here. Because if we stop seeing ourselves in conflict with it, instead of being one with it, right? We are one with all of the things that are happening. Water is happening, air is happening, animals are happening. We are happening. We are part of the is of existence. And so that's why I really like Taoism, because it sort of brings me back. And I've always felt a connection to nature anyway. And this sort of weird dissonance where if you were in the Christian church, that they kind of made you feel like you were separate from it. And there's so much to it now. I mean, if you look into science and discovery, there's studies that show we need to see plants and trees. If we see plants every day, it helps our mood. Like, there's studies on this, and there's even grounding and earthing. We all have a magnetic field, and if we touch the earth physically with our bodies, that it corrects our magnetic field, right? This is something called grounding or earthing. You can look into that. There's studies on that as well. But the Taoism principle really talks about this oneness with the Tao, right? And it's so great because And it's so much mysticism is this. So let me, before I quote the Tao Te Ching, I want to tell you about another thing about Western thought, where we have this very, I guess it comes from, Greek logic and everything, where we sort of have a mutually exclusive, or what's called an either or philosophy or perspective on reality. And what it does is it doesn't allow for paradox. And the thing is there are just some things that cannot be explained with this either or reality. And part of it is our existence. The experience we have doesn't really make sense in a lot of ways unless we're able to use the other perspective, the both and, right, which is an Eastern way of philosophy. But what I love about the Tao Te Ching, the first book and the first chapter, it says this, and it says, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Right? It's like, okay, there is a Tao out there. There is this force that sort of unites everything, that is everything, the eternal being and doing that is there. But we can't describe it with words because it's more than words. And yet, this is the paradox, right now I'm telling you this with words, right? This is still the best way to explain it, but really you have to add to it the experience. And really, the experience is pretty simple. It's being, right? It's the meditation, the contemplation. When we stop thinking, we still are. And I want you to think about that, or experience that, maybe not think about it. But between your thoughts, you still exist. And when you pause and simply take in your senses and look around and see, you still are there. You don't have to think about things. In fact, thinking kind of puts a layer in between us and our reality, right? Because now we're labeling it, we're putting it in little boxes, we're describing it instead of just experiencing it. So I love it that the beginning of the Tao Te Ching starts off with a paradox, right? Where we're telling you about the Tao, but also the words can't explain the Tao, right? And it continues, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. And the nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. Everything comes from this kind of force that's not explainable. And they have another way of explaining this sort of thing in Buddhism, where the Buddhist teachers are showing you the moon, and what they are and what they say is the finger pointing at the moon, right? So a finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, but it points you to it. And that's what we look at, right? Or Alan Watts talks a lot about books and words. It's like, it would be like confusing the words on the page for the actual thing that they describe. Now, our minds are powerful, right? We can read these words and they become concepts in our mind. But the reality is something more. And I think I'll do this later on. I'll be sort of stealing it from Alan Watts, but it's so great. What he will do is say, these are words, but reality is this, and he will bring a chime. And it's very sudden and dynamic. And whoa, you're there. Whoa, the time, and you're not thinking. Whoa, a chime just happened, right? It's very powerful. I think it's one of the reasons they use the chimes for meditation. It really focuses you, right? But there's this isness, there's this being to reality that is beyond thinking, and we experience it. And then in the Christian circles, it's one way to divide it up is cataphatic and apophatic, and I'll talk about this more another time as well. But the cataphatic is sort of the traditional knowledge and everything, and what I've seen is from the Christian church in the modern centuries as we become all cataphatic. It's all about theory and dogma and words and knowledge and concepts, and very little about experience. Now, I happen to come from a branch of Christianity, which is called charismatic, based on the Greek charisma, which means gift, where we believe in miracles and supernatural things happening all the time. So I think I'm in a good place to be open for that sort of thing, right? Where at least I had some experience of God through the charismatic church, where we sometimes experience the Holy Spirit in very powerful ways, right? The Holy Spirit, in this case, another way for the Spirit of God, right? The Spirit of the divine. And we experience that in a way that goes beyond words. And that, I think that helped me understand mysticism because I've already had some experiences of God that way. But speaking of which, the other religions, like Christianity and Islam and Judaism, you could say the Abrahamic religions, don't have as part of their main practice today, I would say at least, mysticism. Though it could be argued that the Franciscans of the Catholics still have that practice, and some of the other monk orders, and that the Eastern Orthodox Church still retains some mysticism. But generally speaking, Western Christianity does not even understand what that is, and when you say the word mysticism to them, they think it's something bad, right? Like I said, there's a lot of contentiousness in church today, and if you bring something up they don't understand, it's usually the devil. So I get a lot of that. But, in Islam, it's not there, but there are these Sufis. And then for Judaism, there's Kabbalah. So there are all over the world, there have been people since the beginning of time awakening to the presence of God. And it's very interesting because one thing Richard Rohr mentions, his book, The Universal Christ, is that, do you really think that God was just doing nothing in those thousands of years before Jesus came? With all the other people on the world, they were just hopeless and God wasn't talking with them or being there for them at all. And if you know God and you understand God as being divine and omnipresent, why would he not interact? Why would she not show up in other people's lives on different places who had no physical way of hearing, the words of Jesus or being in contact with, the Jewish religion, for instance, at that point. And so there has been this always continuous throughout all of human history, mystics, people who have spent time sitting and being quiet and experiencing God and being transformed through it. And this is what has changed me, right? And part of it is sort of a skill, and part of it is a spiritual transformation, right? And it's, part of the skill is when you do meditation. One of my favorite types is similar to Vipassana, and Thomas Keating calls it centering prayer, a Christian version of that, where you observe your thoughts. You observe your thoughts and your senses and your emotions, but it creates sort of a level of separation between you and those things. And so you realize you're not those things. You realize you're not your thoughts. You're not your emotions. You're not your senses. You're something else. You're a true self. And the more I've done that and be able to separate myself, that the more in times of crisis and difficult periods of emotion, that there's sort of a layer between me and those things because I can step back and observe them. Oh, look, I feel angry. My muscles are tense. My heart's beating more quickly. And it gives me a separate place to exist without being in the middle of the emotion and being dragged away with it. So one thing that I want to discuss, part of the definition of mysticism as well, is that it's really not magic. And this might sound unusual to people. Like I said, the definition of mysticism is really not what most people think. And mysticism is really about surrendering to the divine. And in some way, and I may say the universe sometimes, and I think the universe is part of the divine, right? So the universe is the part of the divine we live in. And that we experience this surrender where we allow it to be whatever it is. We don't resist it, right? And you'll see that in Daoism and Buddhism and mysticism, where you accept whatever happens. And even bringing in the Stoics, if you like Stoicism, which sometimes seems a little harsh to me compared to mysticism, but there's an overlap there where the Stoics will say, amor fati, right? Which is love whatever happens, basically, or love your fate. And I translate this as dance along with the music that's playing. Whatever the music is playing in the universe, I'm going to go along with it. But the reason this is sort of the opposite of magic is what magic seeks to do is trying to influence the universe or make it do what you want, right? So when you exercise your power that you have to change the course of events using spiritual forces, that's more like magic, right? And I'm not saying that people can't do both, right? I'm saying that if you really want to understand mysticism, you have to understand surrender. And so trying to apply a sort of magic or a power force to the universe to change it is the opposite of accepting it, right? So they're kind of in opposite poles. And if you read a very, very detailed, long, wonderful book just called Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill, and I have read a third of it. It's big. But this is where she explains this concept. If you want to see more about that, she explains about how magic is more of a taking your will and trying to impose it on the universe, whereas mysticism is accepting the universe the way it is. So that's a distinction. And so I'm trying to make sure that when you hear the word mystic or mysticism, you're not thinking magic, because I don't want you to. And I think it might make you settle more easily. I know the more like Christian or Abrahamic religions are kind of very much against magic. And so this isn't it. This is surrendering to God and being one with God, which is all over the Bible as well. So I want to talk about that. This is sort of how I got, as I said, I came from a Christian background, but all the religions have mysticism. But I want to give you some Bible verses that I saw. So if you talk to other Christians about this, right, you can say, look, I think this is how you're supposed to be, or this is what the Bible says. Don't tell anyone what they're supposed to be. That doesn't go over very well. But John 17, one of my favorites, is Jesus is praying for his followers. He says, I pray also for those who believe me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. Jesus is praying for this. And, if you are a believer in Jesus, do you think Jesus' prayers don't get answered? I think they do. May they also be in us, so the world may believe that you've sent me. And, I have to say, and I don't want to get into the too much, but I'm very sad with the state of Christianity today and where everything is. And, it makes me sad that we're not doing this. But so we talk about being one with God, being one with Jesus, everything connecting together. And I think that's really important. But, another philosophy I have is that God is everywhere, and that you'll see that in the Bible, right? The mystery of God, right? And that's part of where mystics come from, is where part of the world and the universe is a mystery. We can't understand it all through thought. We can't understand it all through categorizing or studying or understanding. It's always going to be a mystery because we're finite, right? And God basically is an infinite, faceted creature being to explore that we can't ever finish. So it's always going to be a mystery. In 1 Kings, the Bible says, but will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. So everything there is can't contain God. In the New Testament, 1 Timothy 6:16 says, who alone possesses immortality and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. Now, we can see parts of God. We can't see all of God. We just are too limited. It's just not possible, right? So there's always the unknowable. There's always the mystery. And that can seem unsettling to people because we want to know everything. And it's so funny because if you talk to Christians, they'll be like, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God all these things, right? It's like, I'm okay with some mystery. Let's have it. Let's bring on the mystery. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. So the experience of God, right, we have, one of the things you have in the Psalms, be still and know that I am God, right? A lot of meditators will talk about this one. There have been, mystic practices of the early saints. They would go out in the desert and be by themselves with God and commune with God and be still and know that God is there. But a few more verses about God that I just want to talk about, and it brought me to God's omnipresent. And this is interesting because if you talk to Christians about this, they're like, I don't know. But it says, for in him we live and move and have our being, referring to Christ. In him we live and move. We have our being in Christ. And some people think this is sort of metaphorical, but if God is everywhere, we're inside God, right? We live inside of God. There's nowhere we can go to get out of it. In fact, that's what the Psalm says right here. It says, where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. And another interesting one about reality in the universe. In Romans, it says, for from him and through him and for him are all things. Which gets pretty deep if you think about it, because you're like, wait a minute, everything is from God. Everything, right? There's not a thing that exists that did not come from the divine, from the source. So nothing is separate from the source. And it gets us, and there's a lot of that. And Ram Dass is pretty good at talking about this stuff, where on one level, on one spiritual level that we can exist at, right? If we let go of the ego and judgment, is that everything is fine and everything is perfect and everything is the way it was meant to be. Even though there's suffering and bad things and, all the things that we see in the world that could be better. But this is, in one sense, the way it's supposed to be. And it's a way of existing. And it's something that Alan Watts will talk about as sort of a divine story or divine play. Like, yes, this is all happening. And personally, I have this analogy for it where the only way I can explain it is as a child. I don't know if you've had this experience. Probably you have. I would guess that you've had an experience like this where you're at like a store with your parents and you really want this thing, like a toy or some candy, and they're not going to buy it for you. They're just not going to do it. And it feels like, you know what I'm saying? It feels like the end of the world, right? You're 8 and your heart is set on this thing and you want to have this thing and you're just suffering and you're miserable and you're crying, and how dare your parents be so unjust to you to not buy you this thing? And I feel like in some sense, maybe all of the suffering and anger and the sadness and the unfairness we see in the world is something like that. Maybe when we grow up to the next level after this, we'll be like, oh, that wasn't really so bad. And there was a purpose for that. And we needed to go through that. And, all those things which otherwise seem very senseless. But if we see everything is connected and that everything is God and the divine, we live inside it, that we're really, another great thing about that is we're really all safe. It's really safe to live. It's safe to live. And I love that. And again, all things have been created through him. This is Colossians 1:16. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So I like to picture this as like, how there's like space between molecules and even inside an atom between the electrons and the protons, and there's a whole empty space. And I feel like that's where God, she's holding everything together, right? It's all held together there. In that space, and that we exist in the fabric of God, and that God is interwoven into all of reality, and the force that makes it reality and makes it exist. And one of the great things about that is realizing that God is right here, and that God is inside me, that God is right outside of me, God is right outside my window, he's in my room, she is everywhere. I don't have to scream to reach heaven. Right? I'm already there. I'm already with God all the time. And so all I ask is that my eyes be opened. That I open up my eyes and, there's God. Right? And we can see, and the more I do these practices, these mystic practices, the more I get to see that. One of the outcomes of mysticism is to be transformed. Like I said, this really saved my life through the meditation, the contemplation, the practices. And Shinzen Young has some great work on dealing with emotions and how to feel. He even calls it something called skill at feeling, where it's made life more bearable. Because I've had a lot of physical health problems. And I've just been through a lot of suffering. And I've had a lot of anxiety my whole life, which I attribute to genetics and maybe exposure to toxic metals when I was a child, but lots of anxiety. And life has been miserable a lot. I've been physically in bed for years at a time sometimes. It's a miracle that I'm functioning now to the level I am. But this transformation has made life so much more livable, and I'm starting to enjoy it now. And one of the great things about this is realizing that, the divine is everywhere, that you can experience these blissful, wonderful moments in the simplest things. And I've had these sort of, like Buddhist monks will talk about these experiences where just something simple like a plate or a bowl or a painting will suddenly jump out at you and be so real and alive and amazing and colorful. And I don't need to have a big magical event happen. I can just experience reality. So I want to talk about one more facet of mysticism before we close. I think it's a very important one, and it's described in different ways in different practices or paths, but we talk about non-dual thinking. And dual thinking really involves separation, kind of like what I talked about earlier, separating us from nature, but also ourselves from the world. Or a lot of us have sort of a line between the material or the physical world and the spiritual, right? But non-dual thinking sees everything as one, right? The terms physical and spiritual are just distinctions that we create in our mind. But everything just simply is. The physical, the spiritual, it all is. But what happens to us, the more we label things and look at reality with labels, the more separation we create between ourselves and everything else. We've got a layer of colors and boxes, and then our thinking often involves, and this is sort of a sign of growing into the second half of life, where you stop labeling everything as good and bad. This is good, this is bad. I like this, I don't like this. Things are. And the more you let things be without labeling them and putting them in boxes, the more you will be approaching non-dual thinking. You just are able to see things as they are. And I think especially now, without getting into it too much, especially in the United States, we have a very polarized way of looking at the world and the two political parties, and it is very an us versus them and good versus evil mindset, and we can really get trapped in that. And that's why I personally have had to give up politics, because it was making me not be able to love people. And I really think that is part of being a mystic and being one with God, is loving everyone and loving God and loving the universe. And many faiths and practices teach that the divine is love and that we exist in love. And so to live in that, we let go of these political arguments and this way of looking at the world. Because really, when we look at the world politically or any other way, we are labeling it. We're putting it in boxes. We're adding layers to it and separating it. And we're separating ourselves from other people. And if we do it enough, other people aren't human anymore, and they aren't part of the divine. But the mystic knows that everyone is part of the divine. We are all participating in this great organism that is God. And that's a good thing. And people are just at different stages of awareness of the universe. And just because we are where we are now doesn't mean we should be arrogant about it, I've had, when I've tried to explain this to people before, the mystic path, that sometimes I've come across as like, oh, my way is the best way or the better way. This way has saved me and transformed me. I will say that. But I never want to come across as this is the best way or the way. Like, if you want to do this, then do it. If you feel called to oneness with the divine, do this. If you don't, then don't do it. There's really no force behind this. There's no urgency. It is a path. It is a pathway. And I'll often talk about my pathway or the different pathways, but I don't think they're necessarily superior. They are. They exist. We all exist, whatever pathway we take or not. And this path is not for us to go above people and judge them. It is simply a path that we can follow if we choose to. And I feel like with the enlightenment and awakening that I've received, I have no choice but to follow it. And as I said, it has really transformed me and made life worth living. So I'm happy that I have done it. So that's really the concepts that I wanted to talk about with mysticism. So remember that mysticism is pursuing the divine, pursuing oneness through practices like meditation and contemplation. Remember that Mysticism is really a surrender to what is and a surrender to the universe without resisting it. Where it's not magic, it's really the opposite of magic. Though some people find ways to practice both, where you sort of, sometimes you live in the ego and maybe the ego is practicing magic, and then when you're out of the ego, you're in the mysticism and not resisting. That's not something I'm doing. I'm just doing the mysticism, really. But then again, sometimes I pray and ask God for things, and so am I not asking for God to change the universe on my behalf? So it's hard to say. But in that, I would say that mysticism is a surrender and a not opposing your will, but instead surrendering your will to the divine and becoming one with the divine. It involves non-dual thinking. That mysticism is found in every major religion on earth, and that it is really a practice of being still, not thinking, but awakening to the reality that exists and has always existed in the present moment, where we always are anyway. And so if you wish to go on this path with me, then I invite you to continue listening to my messages, and don't take it too seriously, and have a good time, and enjoy opening up your awareness to the divine source and everything that simply is. The Mystic Wanderer